you have to learn how to execute at 51% confidence at speed, meaning you're never going to have all the information, but you need to have just enough information to have conviction. And within that conviction is choosing a response versus an emotional reaction.
Welcome into Impactful Conversations, stories and lessons for financial advisors. I'm your host, Dave Edgecombe. Joining me, we've got a good one. I've been looking forward to this one for a few weeks now. We've got Taylor Johnson. He's an executive performance coach. We're thrilled to have you on the podcast, Taylor. Thank you so much for taking the time.
It's great to be here, Dave.
Now, full disclosure, I got to see you in your element presenting to some high performance sales representatives several weeks ago, and it was really enlightening. And what I learned from that and then our ensuing conversations was you're a very curious guy. You ask a lot of questions, which I love, and I have since learned that that's not by accident. That curiosity is sort of not necessarily the cheat code, but it's opened up some opportunities, and it's kind of sort of a tent pole of how you run your operation. So please talk to me a little bit about what curiosity means from a performance standpoint.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll first frame up, I've always said that my passion is performance and it's my curiosity that navigates me through the world. And so for me, curiosity is really just asking better questions. The quality of your answers will come from the quality of your questions. And so that really gives us a lot to play with when we think about, as a professional or individual, where we are now, where we want to be, and asking, well, how do we close that gap? It's the how might we question. And when you develop that sense of self-awareness to drive your performance, because I think really that's the foundational piece, is this deep sense of knowing who you are. It starts with asking the questions and then discovering, well, what might be that next track to get me down the path that I want to go.
That's self-efficacy and knowing, being able to look inward. Has that always come natural, or is that sort of something that's taken practice on your end? And then how do you impart that on the people that you work with?
Yeah, well, self-efficacy really is the extent to which an individual believes they can achieve a desired result. And within self-efficacy, there's a couple of components. The first one is being able to understand and articulate your process. The second is you have to have the capacity to produce results. And the third piece of this is having an honest self-assessment for your own development. And so the self-efficacy for me and this curiosity, I would say really has been learned over time. And it's become a foundational pillar in my own process of how I think and articulate my process and how I achieve and get results, not only for myself, but for my clients.
So how do you then impart that mindset onto the people that you work with?
Yeah, great question.
I imagine it can't be easy.
Yeah, well, it really depends on the individual, right? And so really we have to start with understanding, well, how did you get to where you are now? And so my first big session with the client is 2 hours and we do a deep dive and it's built on the work of Joseph Campbell. For those who aren't familiar with Joseph Campbell, he was fascinated with mythology, specifically around this hero's journey, these evolutions that we go through when we have a calling, we cross the threshold into the unknown. And through this process of discovery, there's lessons, there's heroes, there's villains, there's helpers, there's guides. And we ultimately come back to this real world transformed and changed. And so that first kickoff session really is setting the foundation to ask the question, well, how did we get to where we are now? Right? What were the values, the beliefs, the behaviors, the guiding principles that gave us the raw materials of where we are right now? And part of that process then is asking the question, well, what is still working for me? If I have this vision of where I want to go, what have I developed so far that is still working that I can amplify? The other part is saying, well, what's not working? What maybe needs to change or get optimized, or in some cases, be completely removed and replaced with something else. And so that first initial session really kind of sets the foundation for asking those questions and digging a little bit deeper, probably deeper than most have thought before. They've maybe reflected a little bit, but this is a much more intentional process. And from there, we start to build the flywheel of feedback loops. And all it really is, Dave, is you're just running little experiments. You're saying, hey, let's start with this one component, make an adjustment, and then start to pressure test it. And through that pressure testing, you're gaining more awareness, you're asking better questions, and that continues to take you down your path.
One thing that I love from the presentation that I saw you give was the mindset of not asking someone who's a peak performer, someone who's really good at something to do the same thing. And the idea that you need to take them outside their comfort zone. And that's where the real development occurs. So talk
Yeah.
to me a little bit about your experience with that. I know you've got maybe one or two stories that you could share with me about
Sure.
some of those real life the way that you've instilled that with some of the people that you've worked with.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to frame up maybe a bit of my own journey and why I view things the way I do now and continue to evolve. So, I mean, my background's in athletic performance. I came up coaching in college in the NFL for about 10 years. And that path, while if you zoom out, looks linear, it was very much all over the place. And part of that process, again, was that curiosity of saying, hey, being a high performer on any given Sunday or any given game day is much more than just pushing, pulling the weights. It's your mindset, nutrition, and this holistic approach to doing what you do to perform at a high level. And then being in the NFL was amazing. And I realized it just wasn't the end all be all for me. And so from there, I jumped from elite physical performance into elite cognitive performance with gaming and esports. And then from there, I got into startups and gaming development, and then eventually doing what I do now, which is I call them business athletes, right? These are the individuals, high performance output. They have this competitive drive, and really, business and sales is a competitive sport. So, how can you think of it and yourself in that way to set up your process and development? And so, your question around getting people to think that way and stretching outside your comfort zone. I'm also a partner of another group called the Liminal Collective, and we work across business, sports, military, and creative arts. And so when we take these elite performers, we can't just do what we've always done with them. Like if you take an elite downhill skier and just have them ski more, that's not going to stretch them outside their comfort zone. So you have to take them outside their normal environment and shake things up. And so there's these core mindsets that we really play around with. The first one is challenge versus threat. Do you see things as a challenge and lean in, or do you see it as a threat and pull back? And you can manufacture these environments to have them start to stretch and pressure test these different mindsets. And so the example that I gave is, gosh, it'd be a couple months now. A couple months ago, we took a group of cyber operators out to the ocean. So we were running a camp with them on West Coast California, and we woke them up, zero dark 30, gave them some wetsuits, said, "We're going for a swim." And they're like, "What?" And, we have our team out there. We got safety people out there as well, for sure. And I'm out there with a paddle board and I'm just paddling and it's pitch dark. They're in the ocean. They've got wetsuits. They've got a life vest on, little glow sticks on them. So we're not losing track of anybody. But they didn't know that was going to happen. And that is an example of taking elite performers in one context and putting them in a completely different environment to start to have them think just a little bit differently. And so the moral of that story is you get them in these different environments, and when they come out of that new environment that stretched them, you can then draw the bridge back to their day to day. So where else in your day to day do you have moments in any situation where you have this choice point between a challenge or a threat? And when can you lean in just a little bit more versus pull back? And what question can you ask to be even more present and grounded in that moment to then unlock a new realm of performance for yourself?
You mentioned the clients that you work with being competitive. I know that a lot of the financial advisors we work with also
Oh, yeah.
competitive. And you also mentioned game day, which was
Yeah.
one of the things that you touched on in your presentation was pregame, game day, and postgame, and how the average person views that, and then how an elite performer views those three phases of life. Walk me through those three phases, but then also what the mindset shift is that really separates those camps.
Yeah. So when we think about sport, there's these three phases that everybody is pretty familiar with: pregame, game day, and postgame. Pregame is the planning, the preparation, the strategy, the practice reps. Game day is the moment of truth, right? It's the execution, it's the present in real time feedback. Postgame is the learning and reflection. Now, that order sounds logical, right? Pregame, game day, postgame. But the best at what they do, first and foremost, they have a deep sense of self awareness, right? They understand what lights them up, how to switch on, how to switch off. And what they do is they switch that order where they really index on the post game. So they start with post game first. What did I just learn from this last game day or the last practice reps that I can then leverage for the next practice and the next game? So they're spending more time thinking about the lessons that they can leverage to move them forward. And we call that learning velocity. So, how can you increase your learning velocity, the speed at which you're learning? Because the key to learning is to change your behavior. Otherwise, why else do it? And so, giving yourself a framework to think about that and actually capture those lessons. And then, most importantly, ask the question, well, what's the behavior I'm going to change to get a better outcome and a better output? That's where, that can take an average individual in a competitive sense and make them great. And that's what I love doing with individuals is helping them develop that framework to systematically work through post game, pregame, and game day.
It's a natural progression to one thing that I really was looking forward to talking with you about because it was the one thing that at the sales retreat that you spoke with, that the people in attendance, they kept bringing up the AARs, the after action reviews. This was, I mean, like I said, every person brought it up, every person globbed onto it, and that was going to be the one thing that they were going to implement into their life, and it pairs itself well with that self-reflection, but also being able to look back and prepare and look forward a little bit better. So walk me through the after action review and how it's been so valuable.
Yeah. So the after action review is taken from the military. And when you think about elite teams and elite organizations, you can look to the military and the special operations for being elite. And there's a number of reasons for that. And one of them is that reflection tool called an after action review. And you could do this for an individual or for a team or for an organization. So it's really scalable. And the whole premise is to deconstruct an event that happened. And it's very simple. You're just asking 4 questions. What did I expect to happen? What actually happened? What did I learn? And what will I do differently next time? That's it. Very simple. Simple, yet really impactful. And if, for those listening, you could probably think of a time where you've had something that happened. You're like, okay, yeah, we won or we lost that deal, or it went the way I thought it might go, or it didn't really go the way I thought it might go. And that's kind of it. There's no real goal that's captured and lesson that's leveraged. And so having this framework gives you a very simple process to follow to say, okay, well, what actually happened here? And what's the insight that I can then leverage and make one small adjustment moving forward? And again, this could be on a micro scale for an individual. So like right after you get off a call with a prospective client, you could say, okay, well, what did I expect to happen in this call? What actually happened? Did we get to the endpoint or the next call or whatever CTA to move them down the line to become an actual client? Did that happen? Yes or no? Well, why is that? What did I learn from that interaction? Was it in the questions that I asked? Did I maybe not lean in? Did maybe I get caught off guard? And then you take that information and say, well, what will I do differently next time? Either for a similar type of client or a similar situation. And when you can do this consistently and build this into your process, it starts to give you this powerful tool of pattern recognition where you start to notice the themes and the trends and you don't repeat the same mistakes. You learn from them and you actually leverage that to move you forward. And so all of my clients, they know that when we get on our sessions, the very first thing we do is an after action review. So from the last time we met till now, I take them through those questions and we really index on the lessons learned and the change in their behavior. And that's what we're tracking against. And for teams, this becomes an incredibly powerful tool. You need to educate the teams on how to do it properly because it's not about role, it's not about status or title. It's not about how they felt, it's purely about the facts. And that's very different than the classic kind of debrief or retrospective, where oftentimes you're kind of pointing fingers like Bobby didn't do this, Sally didn't do that. No, that doesn't matter. It's getting everybody's perspective on what they saw because everybody's perspective is unique and valuable. And you're just getting down to the core facts. And then you create this mind share through that process. And then you log all of those lessons and the changes of behavior so that everybody is learning from each other, whether it's within one team or cross functionally across other teams. And that's how, as an organization, you move very quickly. And that becomes a competitive advantage.
Yeah, I think the team component of it and sort of looking at an event and looking back on it, it reminds me a lot of if you're working in live production, you have a postmortem on an event and say, okay, this is the event's over. Everyone's left except for us. Let's go over what went wrong and what went right. And there's yeah, sure, there's shareholders there and there's titles still there. And some of the feedback that I get from our advisors is people aren't necessarily honest in those moments, even though you think, hey, no, this is a safe space. You can say whatever you want. Well, not everyone believes that because they've been tricked before or whatever. So, in that scenario, how do you fix that? How do you fix it when an advisor doesn't feel like we're not maximizing those after action reviews or those postmortems on if a seminar went well or what went wrong in our sales process?
Yeah, well, you alluded to it a little bit. I'm curious, from your perspective, when you've done those, what do you think really gets in the way there?
I mean, it's probably consequences of speaking freely, I would
Yeah,
think, would
yeah,
be well, I really have something to say, but my boss is sitting right there and he's going to be my boss tomorrow too. So I got to be careful. I got to tread lightly. I got to think carefully here.
yeah. So what I'm hearing in that, maybe said another way, is it's fear. Fear gets in the way, and that's a very real thing. And oftentimes, it's an indication of the culture of that team or that organization. And so, to help mitigate or change that takes just a lot of education and a lot of reinforcing. And oftentimes, when you're introducing an after action review, a lot of pre framing. And what I mean by that is saying, like, hey, here are our rules of engagement of how we run this meeting. And it takes the constant reinforcing that. And then whoever is facilitating that meeting, at least initially, has to be really good about saying, hey, we're getting off course here. Remember, just the facts, not the story, not your interpretation, just the facts. And just by the act of doing that, I'm actually working with another um, company and organization, and they do production as well. I'm helping the team kind of get better at accelerating this process for them. And it's a lot of education, a lot of reinforcing the fundamentals of what it actually is and what it's not.
Why is it so important for these internal questions, whether it's an after action review that you're doing individually or with a team, that the questions are so straightforward and that there's not a lot of fluff?
Well, let me ask you the question back. Like, what if there weren't straightforward, and what if there was a lot of fluff? How might that go, do you think?
Well, probably talking in circles and probably not coming up with tangible action items would be my thought.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And if we've all been in those meetings where we're not really clear why we're there, we're not really clear like the actual objective, or if there is an objective up front, the meeting drifts and you're all over the place. And so by the end of the meeting, there's no clear outcome of what did we actually just talk about here. And so the simplicity of the questions helps keep it very simple and very much to the point. And it almost becomes like this North Star of like, hey, here's actually what we want to get out of this call, right? We want to know, what did we expect to happen? What actually happened? What did we learn? And what are we doing differently next time? And so it becomes like this anchor point. If anyone in the conversation starts to drift, they could say, well, where are we at right now? Like, how are we actually doing? And so when you think through those questions and you think through those meetings, I encourage people to have those questions written out and either record the call so you have the transcript of the notes, or a note taker going through that. And you're constantly checking, like, are we actually hitting on the milestones of the conversation itself? And that's a really useful practice to reinforce, not only for yourself, but also for your team. So you actually stay on track and you get stuff done. Because we've all been in those meetings. I mean, people have so many meetings. And it's like, are we actually moving the needle here? Are we just having a conversation to have a conversation?
Yeah, I think here at Impact, I think we had that realization that we were having too many meetings. We need to scale back and be more precise with our time. So no, I
Yes.
think that's an example of kind of looking inward and trying to be a little bit more efficient and looking inward like that. One thing that you talked about, you already said it, challenge versus threat. The other one that I kind of earmarked during your presentation was respond versus react.
Mm,
And yes, it has similar, you know, connective tissue to to challenge versus threat, but respond versus react. Talk to me more about that concept and what that mindset shift can do for somebody.
yeah. I'll share the second mindset because they actually build on each other. So the first one is challenge versus threat, right? Do you see it as a challenge and lean in, threat, or pull back? The second is assess versus assume. When you lean in and see it as a challenge, are you assessing the situation and asking better questions? Or are you making assumptions? And the more you can eliminate assumptions and ask better questions, the more information is present. Therefore, that leads into the next one. Are you going to have an emotional reaction based on a lack of information and based on seeing it as a threat? Or are you going to choose to see it as a response, which is an intentional decision in that moment, given the information that you have? And that becomes really powerful because if you actually take a moment to step back for a second and say, okay, the choices or decisions I've made in the past that maybe I'm like, oof, that was a mistake, or maybe I feel a little bit of regret. Chances are it was a reaction, meaning you didn't give yourself a beat to slow down and say, what's actually happening here? How might I respond with a clear head and come from a place of like we call it baseline, right? You're not too high, you're not too low. You're right at the sweet spot of emotional and cognitive regulation to say, what's the best decision in this moment? And one of my mentors, a very successful entrepreneur, he told me, he goes, Taylor, you have to learn how to execute at 51% confidence at speed, meaning you're never going to have all the information, but you need to have just enough information to have conviction. And within that conviction is choosing a response versus an emotional reaction. And I quote Viktor Frankl from a man's Search for Meaning, fantastic book, and he talks about the difference between the stimulus and response. You have something that happens, and along this path, like you could have a reaction or you can choose a response, but the space between that gives you the power to choose, and that's 100% in your control. And so this goes back into understanding and have the self-awareness to say, okay, I'm feeling a little bit dysregulated. Let me just take a beat. Let me take a breath. Let me choose my response. And for individuals that are dealing in high stakes environments, which a lot of my clients do, or they're operating in very high stakes, very important conversations, multi-threaded communications, their ability to remain calm and choose a response or a reaction could make or break the deal. And that's why it becomes even more powerful to practice that. And you could do it day to day.
Why is it so important to pause? Why is the ability to stop and think so important, and how is it achievable? How is someone able to kind of enact that?
Well, I think a good way to think about it is, well, what's the inverse? If you're not giving yourself time to process, you could make a decision that leads to a less than ideal outcome. And that's not to say like, hey, you need to come back a day later. Sometimes it's just one breath, one breath. And within that space, you give yourself time to process what was actually said. What's the information that I have? What's one question I can follow up? Maybe probe and clarify a little bit. And the way you can practice that pause, I mean, literally is in every interaction. So I have a couple of clients where very intelligent, very, very witty. They can fire off comebacks and like they are right in the pocket. And even with them, getting them to take one breath before they speak does a couple things. One, it helps with their executive presence. They're not always just jumping in to answer the question. They're controlled, composed, thoughtful. The other is they're actually giving themselves, I mean, sometimes they think so fast, they're running through like 5 different permutations of what could happen, and they're just grabbing one. So it gives them a chance to kinda check, double check, and say, "Yeah, this is the thing that I wanna say," and then adjust based on the feedback. And so moment to moment, another mentor of mine said, "Hey, look, the more crazy your calendar is, the better." And I was like, "What do you mean by that?" He goes, "Well, think about all of the opportunities of conversations and interactions. These are practice reps. And it's very different than from a physical standpoint where you can only physically tax yourself so much before inevitably you have to rest and recover. On the cognitive side, yeah, you do reach a point of diminishing returns. You may get some cognitive load and fatigue. But even in those moments, that's when you can still practice quality reps. When you're under fatigue or when you have a bit of brain fog, can you still think clearly? Can you still train yourself to take a pause, to not react, to choose a response? I mean, that's when it becomes even more powerful for, high performing individuals to develop that skill set.
Talk to me about the performance curve. I know that that was big. That was a big one that you talked about at the sales retreat, and I think that also elicited some pen draw. People,
Yeah,
it
yeah.
struck a chord with people because I think it really was eye opening to view performance through that lens. So, talk to me a little bit about the performance curve.
Yeah, so the performance curve is taken from Yerkes Dotson, and essentially it's this relationship between stress and arousal and performance. So if you imagine an inverted U, and across the x-axis is stress and arousal, the y-axis is your performance. And so because it's an inverted U, it looks like a bell curve, um, higher in the middle. And what you think about is there's on the far right, high stress, high arousal, low performance. On the far left, low stress, low arousal, low performance. But in the middle, there's the fatness of that curve. That's the sweet spot. The right amount of stress, the right amount of arousal, the highest level of performance. And oftentimes we kind of know that about ourselves. And the analogy that I build for people is, for those that drink coffee can appreciate this, is like, can you think of a time where you've had way too much caffeine? All right, where you are not optimal. Like, it kinda defeats the purpose of why you drink caffeine in the first place. Like, you're racing thoughts, hands are shaking, your eyes are jittering, low performance. You're not performing at the level that you wanted to. So that would be super far right, high arousal, high stress, low performance. And then think of the opposite. Think of a time where maybe you woke up and you didn't sleep well the night before. You didn't eat right, and just a lot of other factors where it's low arousal, low stress, and low performance. And it's like pushing thoughts through jello. And then think of a time where you had the right amount of sleep, the right amount of caffeine, that right hydration, nutrition, all the things that you know that feel right, and you're completely dialed. Well, how do you know that? It's because of the self-awareness, like what's too much, what's too little, and what's just right. And so when you have an individual go through this exercise of drawing this curve and really thinking about, okay, well, when am I at my best? When am I at that optimal, that sweet spot? And then the follow-up question is, well, what gets me there? What are the things that I know that help me get in that sweet spot? And then you start to index on that. And then the next question is, well, when am I at my worst on either extreme? And people usually tend to be on one side or the other. So you start to unpack that a bit. And what that does is it gives you this map of your performance to then think more thoughtfully around, well, how can I get myself more into this optimal? And the point I want to make too is most people, you hear a lot of people talk about peak performance. They have no idea what they're talking about. No idea. Like, to reach peak performance, it doesn't happen very often. And what happens when you peak? You come right back down. And so to say you're chasing peak performance, to me, that's saying you just want to be a flash in the pan. Like, you're not gonna be able to sustain that. For an average individual whose full-time job is not to get to peak and then have the proper rest and recovery to then be able to do it again, and even still, it's like over longer periods of time. Really what we want to chase and go after is optimal, which means being at your best with whatever resources you have in that moment and doing the best you can with what you got. And you can identify what is the upper and lower limit to that, and then help really shape your environment, shape your routines, shape your process so that you stay in that sweet spot more than you're not.
This has all been great stuff. I got one last thing for you, and it's about fighting stagnancy because I think it really harkens back to the staying curious and why that's been so important. So, what do you say to somebody, a client that you work with, where they feel like they're just stuck and they feel like they're not seeing the improvement that they're accustomed to seeing? What's the antidote for that sort of thing?
It really depends because everybody's plateau looks a little bit different. But where I would start with an individual again is say, hey, well, what got you to where you are now? And when you've been at your best, where the plateau is nowhere in sight, what are you doing? What are you not doing? And relative to that, how much of that is present right now? And sometimes for a plateau, it's, there's a couple of different ways to think about it. And one of them is like, well, they've just done what they've always done, and that's no longer working for them. It's kind of the classic, what got you here is not going to get you there. And there's no judgment in that. Say, great, this is an amazing opportunity to reimagine how you think about your performance, your process, and your development. And a big part of, I think, that too is just appreciating that your values change over time. So a lot of times when people hit a plateau, underneath that, below the surface, the questions are, well, what do you value in this stage and phase that's different than other phases? What's changed? And because your values drive beliefs and beliefs drive behaviors. So for some, it's rediscovering their core values and the inspiration that's taken from that and how to fuel their forward momentum. And then for others, it's reimagining what success actually looks like. They kind of maybe hit this good enough line. And the difference between, being a challenger mindset and a champion mindset, the thing that divides it is this good enough line. And to cross that threshold takes a different stance and a different view on, well, what does performance really mean for me? And what does success really look like? And how might I unlock that for myself? And sometimes it's very small things. Other times it's like, oh, we need to do an overhaul in terms of how you're thinking and how you're operating. In either case, it's fine, but really it comes back to that self awareness piece for them to get really honest with themselves. Because if you're not honest, then you're just going to keep putting around the same stance you've been.
Well, I'll be honest with you. This has been great. I'm glad that we were able to carve out some time and kind of take a semi deep dive because I know there's a lot more layers to the onion. Taylor, where can people find you? Where can people see some of the content that you put out?
Yeah, I appreciate that. So taylorjohnsonperformance.com is my website. I post pretty regularly on LinkedIn. So if you just type in Taylor Johnson, and I'll give you the links for the show notes as well. But those are the two places. And really, again, what I would encourage everybody is to stay curious, right? Be bold. And more than anything is play your own game because that's where the real performance and unlock comes from.
Well said, Taylor. Thank you so much for taking the time, and thank you for watching. We hope that you like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a great place to grow your practice. We've got all kinds of great resources, whether it's selling with stories, house rules, or testimonials from some of the advisors that we work with. They're all great places. And of course, if you like and subscribe, you will stay up on the latest when you know exactly when the new podcast drops. And you just will improve your life, much like Taylor is here to help you get along with. So, Taylor, once again, thank you so much, and thank you, and we'll see you next time.